Good evening. Welcome to the City of Melbourne's Conversation series. My name is James Young. I'll be your MC for this evening. I'm here with Councillor Ken Ong, Kate Shaw and Helen Marcoux for this topic today, music activism. Save live Australian music, where are you now? Given the topic, perhaps, Helen, I might start with you, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Slam, the rally, and 2 years later, where you find yourself.
Hello everyone. So the Slam Rally of 2010, can I just get a quick show of hands as to who may have marched on the day? Okay, pretty good idea here. So the Slam Rally was initiated after a single issue that came to light. We had a law and order policy that equated live music, live or amplified music, with high-risk activity. So many of our small venues were hit by this blanket stroke from liquor licensing policy, and we had a hemorrhage. Something like 126 venues either reduced or cancelled their live music programs altogether. And the tote was the catalyst that triggered the interest for Quincy and myself, because that's our local pub, just around the corner from where we live. Yet, working at Bakehouse and chewing the fat with lots of musicians, we had plenty of people coming through and talking about losing their gigs. So there was an obvious problem out there. So we pulled together the Slam Rally, and for those of you who marched know that it was a really festive, colourful day, and perhaps as the organisers of Slam were a bit naive, we thought we'd put on this great big party, and the government had changed the law, it'd all be great and we could just go back to our regular work. But unfortunately, when you pick a fight with the government, you're up for the negotiation, and it's up to you to present the policy. So we spent a further 9 months working really hard on negotiating the live music agreement. On the eve of the actual rally, we signed the accord, which was an agreement to agree, but then the finer detail came out. And from that, some great achievements were the breaking of the proxy. Live music was no longer equated with high risk or violence. A lot of those licences that were put out there were rolled back. Help desk was set up at liquor licensing, and it was important that we asked for a commission of a report into live music. Well, violence was one of the things we asked to look into, but the other things were the economic, cultural and social benefits of live music. Now, something like this historically had never been done, and it's very important for our bean counters there to know where we sit in an economic context. So that was commissioned. That was a Deloitte's Access Economics report, and some really incredible statistics. You know, more people go and see live music in small venues. Something like 5.1 million people throughout the course of the year, and something like 4.5 million go and see AFL home and away games. So it indicated the absolute passion that we have in this state for live music. On from there, so we had the live music agreement, change of government, and one of the promises from the now Baillieu government was that they actually changed the object of the Liquor Licensing Act to acknowledge and protect live music into the future. Now, the Raise the Bar campaign that happened up in Sydney, and Dr. Shane Homan's here in the audience, you might want to bail him up afterwards, but he spent, along with the other activists up there, close to 8 years, is that correct, Shane? Working. 6 years, sorry, I'm Greek, I like to inflate numbers a little bit. Anyway, 6 years working on that change of liquor licensing legislation. We did it in just under a year here. So from there, and then Slam have continued, because with all this momentum that we've gathered and the knowledge that we've gained, we became a bit of the go-to people. Now, just to let you know, Slam is not funded. We're a volunteer organisation. We went national this year on the anniversary of Slam Day, and unprecedented support and participation. 145 venues around the country had a Slam Day event, and now we're finding little pockets of Slam coming up all over Australia. In Adelaide, they've had some success there with a lot of the problems they're having, and federally with John Wardle, I always call him a doctor, everyone around me, has had some great success federally lobbying for more funding for contemporary music. So apart from the successes, we're still going because there is a hell of a lot of work to do, and that's the discussion we'll segue into.
Thank you, Helen. So I might direct my next question to Councillor Ken Ong and perhaps begin by an introduction to a scenario that's close to me, but I think representative of a large-scale issue facing Melbourne and music at the moment. As I mentioned before, I'm one of the co-owners and the band booker at the Cherry Bar in ACDC Lane, Melbourne. The bar's been around for 13 and a half years, and I've been involved as an owner for 7 years. I bought the bar just to make sure I could always get in, which was a good starting point, but I've fallen in love with the bar and love booking the bands. Cherry finds itself, I think, in an important size and an important place. With a capacity of 200 people, it's a good size for young, up-and-coming bands to play at. When they do their launches, they bring their friends, they can get a reasonable crowd. We're open 7 nights a week. We have live music a minimum of 6 nights a week, and I'm booking 550 bands a year, almost all of whom are Melbourne local acts. Personally, I think a venue like the Corner Hotel is probably the best venue in Melbourne, but with an 800 capacity, it's international acts or very well-established Australian acts that play there. And it's the feeder venues of the Cherry size that are really important. And we've managed to flourish and bloom for 13 years now. With a late night licence, we're open till 3 a.m. Sunday to Wednesday, and we're open till 5 a.m. Thursday, Friday and Saturday. And pleasingly, in the 13 years that we've existed in Melbourne, we've never had any serious issues of any description, no issues with liquor licensing, pleasingly, and no issues with noise. Something that's strikingly obvious if you've been to Cherry recently is there used to be a building at the end of ACDC Lane. It's gone. It's an enormous site. There's a 12-storey residential apartment block going up. Where 189 apartments will be there, many of them with north-facing balconies facing up ACDC Lane. And this is of real concern for myself as an owner of the bar and for the Melbourne music community in terms of the potential threat for a late-night, noisy rock and roll venue. So I suppose my first question to you, Ken, hopefully you can allay my fears. What is the process in terms of permits and letting developers know about the implications for existing business, given that there's the real concerns from the existing businesses about the implications to the existing culture and the music scene?
Thanks, James. That's quite a long question. Yes, yes. There's probably several parts to that question. But the first point that you raised with particular interest to your own premises, I think you're right in that sense that the development, which is considered the agent of change, will have new people living in that apartment. And the City of Melbourne is fully aware that there will be a lot of growth in the city. And the numbers may indicate there'll be 4,000 or 5,000 apartments or residences coming into the City of Melbourne per year. In terms of apartments in the city, there are a lot of applications coming through. We have an estimate that maybe 30% will never get built because they're either non-viable projects or banks will consider them non-viable, so the developers will not get funding. Irrespective of that, there will be a few thousand apartments coming on board in the city per annum over the coming years. So how do we handle that as a city? The City of Melbourne's planning scheme looks at the amenities surrounding these new developments, especially high-rise apartments, and we put conditions on the permits. And there's a particular requirement under the Environmental Protection Act called SEP 2. Now that's specifically looking at what sort of noise coming out of existing venues are allowed, that's inside the buildings, with the windows closed, and with sound attenuation measures put in place that ensures that the noise level within the habitable rooms of the new developments are no greater than 45 decibels. So for example, I take your case.
Yes.
let's say, if the festival or your venue is generating noise, and it's say 72 decibels, the requirement, and that's an existing level, so the requirements for the development needs to put in place windows and materials that are designed to reduce, basically to drop the decibels once inside the buildings by 27 decibels. And that means they have to construct it in such a way there are no gaps. It's not like when they have the window opens and they say, it's not 45. They have to close the window. And if it's more than 45, you're in trouble. Well, if it's less than 45, you're fine.
I think you are 100% right, Ken. We are in trouble because once there's a balcony 10 metres from the stage, suddenly there's been a significant change. And you mentioned the concept of agent of change. Perhaps Kate Ross from the University of Melbourne, you could explain what that concept is to myself and the people in the room?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The agent of change principle came out of the live music task force that was formed in response to Fair Go for live music back in the early 2000s and around 2003, when there was a threatened closure of, oh my God, I can't remember what it was now. No, the Empress, the Rainbow, there was a whole stack of them. It's a very simple principle. What it says is that the responsibility for soundproofing, so that a normally compliant live music venue doesn't become non-compliant by virtue of a building being built right up next door to it. The responsibility for that soundproofing rests with the agent of change, that is the developer, the person who's actually building the residential building. There's a whole bundle of issues that's tied up into that make it complicated. The first is that it's not actually a part of the planning scheme. It's actually officially known as a practice guide, and it is a part of the planning system. It doesn't have any statutory authority, and it is located in this very weird place called reviews, and it's sort of jammed between the review of dry cleaning practices and a little bit later helipad standards. So most people don't actually know that it exists. A lot of council planners don't know that it exists, and they don't know where to find it, even if they know that it does exist. It doesn't in any event have any requirement capacity about it. The second issue is that the state environment protection policy that Ken was referring to, SEP N2. SEP N2 refers to noise levels, and it's a regulatory framework that sits within the Environment and Protection Act. It sets levels.
And this was set in 1978, as I understand.
It was indeed, but when there was virtually nothing happening in the city. So there's that question. Maybe it's time for them to be revised anyway, and the levels are very low. The second thing is that whilst there are standards for reasonable noise levels within habitable rooms, it is also measured, it can be measured at wherever it gives rise to the complaint. So if somebody is sitting on their outside balcony next to Cherry Bar and the levels are above 45 or whatever the accepted thing is, that still constitutes the basis for a complaint. So you can see what I'm saying about when a development comes right next to a formally compliant venue, it can make it non-compliant through no fault of its own. And this question about where you measure the levels is highly problematic. That means that we need to actually look at revisiting SEP N2, the levels and where it's measured. The sort of third main area, and this is the one that's starting to really worry me, is the question of enforcement. Even if the City of Melbourne does implement these conditions such that the rooms are nominally not going to be more than 45 decibels when they're being sealed and when Cherry's at full belt, which, I mean that's not going to happen anyway, it's going to be way more than 45, so that's inadequate. But in any event, the developer just has to promise that they are going to insulate the building to that extent. And as soon as you get to the point of occupancy, there is no way of preventing the people who are moving in, if the job has been done inadequately, from still complaining, because there's this notion of right, this fascinating issue of rights and human rights and what people have got a right to do and not do, and everybody has a right to object to music. So there's this sort of interesting question of rights. So I'm thinking at the moment about how we might enforce that. And one possibility is that you might make compliance with the levels, and you might have to increase those levels. You make compliance with those levels a condition of the developer receiving the certificate of occupancy at the end of the process. So at that point, the developer has to show that, you know, it's all safe and that, you know, everything works and the plumbing works and that, you know, bits of masonite aren't going to drop on people's heads. And one of those things ought to be also a test of those levels. Now, all of these things are doable, and we also need to change, obviously, the location of the agent of change principle in the first instance from a non-statutory place in the planning system to a statutory place in the planning system, and that is in the state planning policy framework, actually in the scheme, which makes it, you know, a legal requirement. Now, I know I'm getting very technical on all of this, and I won't go on about it, but the reason why I am is because I think it's actually very important that we all be educated about this. I mean, none of it's, you know, incomprehensible. It's complex, but we actually need to develop a vocabulary so that we can all talk intelligently about this, and so that we can state very, very clearly to councillors and to the state government about what it is that we believe is the problem and what we think is required in order for it to change. So there's a list of things there, and maybe we can now throw it open to, well, actually I'd like to ask you, Ken, how you feel that you can address these issues and all of them that I've raised in regard to Cherry Bar.
Thanks for that question.
Welcome.
First of all, the step into guidelines defined by the EPA, the EPA actually does not do any enforcement. They sort of palm it off to councils. So councils actually, say for example, the City of Melbourne had about 400 complaints last year, roughly. 50 of them relate to music and very few relate to live music venues. But irrespective of any complaint, we have to take the role, send out the consultants, send out specialists to actually do measurements, noise measurements, at our cost, which is actually quite costly, and then have to respond back to all the complainants. And complainants are not always satisfied. My fellow councillor here, by the way, I forgot to acknowledge Kathy Oakes here tonight too. Good to see you. And we've been trying to handle the colonial complaint for several months now. And it looks like there's a resident that moved into the area and complains about a particular venue, and we have to send out experts, measures and all that. But because they're guidelines and they're not mandatory requirements, it's subjective, and you've got to debate it. As chair of planning, my view on certain areas, we have a lot of discretionary requirements within the Melbourne planning scheme. Every time we try to put something mandatory, we can't get the planning scheme amendment through the system, because mandatory, some state levels, for going back many years, just refuse to put those in. We're still continuing to push certain areas that will become mandatory, certain parts of the scheme. Now, this area has not been included at this stage. And what you say is a relevant point. Even if we put it in the planning scheme, certain requirements, and make it mandatory requirements, the part about approving the buildings for occupancy, the Building Act, and the building inspectors, they're actually not part of our control mechanism. The ones who actually inspect the building, check the plumbing, electricity, and everything else, and then issue the building permit is actually separate.
It's a whole of government's question. So are you prepared as chair of the planning committee to advocate on behalf of the City of Melbourne for changes to the necessary aspects of the legislation and regulatory framework to make it work?
In principle, I agree that that's something we need to do. I've raised this issue with the City of Yarra as well, who suffer from similar issues. Because I represent the City of Melbourne on what the group called IMAP, the Inner Melbourne Action Plan, which covers City of Yarra, Stonington, Port Phillip, and ourselves, and now Maribyrnong is coming in. this is an issue that we've discussed, and as you say, it's a whole of government thing. Even if 4 local government authorities says that we need to do this, we still have to put in planning scheme amendments on each of our own planning schemes to the minister to get it approved.
I would suggest that we make it an amendment to the state planning policy framework, which means that all of the councils need to just get together, and that is then an amendment that the state government makes to its own planning scheme. We've got Fair Go, we've got SLAM, we've got the grassroots. I mean, the next step really is for the councils to get together. I mean, we're kind of moving up and up in the levels to advocate to DPCD that they make that change. That's pretty straightforward. So will you work with the other councils to ensure that those councils do lobby effectively?
I always work with other councils, except that not every council has the same priorities. Now, we try to do as much as we can in the city. I'm happy to push that through IMAP, and then depending on how IMAP takes that on board, because DPCD is also involved with IMAP.
So just quickly, Helen, before we go to the public, why should we be fighting to preserve these tiny venues in an environment where more people want to come and live?
Well, our angle at SLAM has always been that culture is important as diet, health, everything in your life. It makes a holistic society, you know, particularly music and live music. Have it when we're born, we have it when we die, we use it to celebrate. It's part of every aspect of our lives. And the ability to participate in our culture and also be a cultural practitioner. You know, Melbourne is known as one of the greatest live music cities in the world. We have a fantastic, every night of the week you can go and see so many fantastic gigs at such a high level of musicianship as well. We've got a great educated music-going public who have come from years and years of excellent community radio. You know, what came first, the chicken or the egg, the public or the radio? And yet we're seeing the demise of so many of the venues that were here for a long time. It's very difficult to open a new venue in this state. The amount of compliance and regulation that's involved make it almost impossible. So it's important that we preserve these cultural clusters that have sprung up over many years and these places that provide a positive culture. Now, I've been listening to Ken and I've sat on lots of committees with different councils, and the story is the same. Well, we can't do it even though we believe in it. In principle, we do. So it's important that IMAC or MAV get together, and not only is it about preserving culture, which is incredibly important to all of us, but also we have to look at, you know, the conflict minimisation in the future. If this agent of change principle is in our statutory regulatory framework, saying that after a few glasses of wine, if it's put into the framework, we will find that the agent of change is in there. The onus is on the developer to properly attenuate for their residents. So in effect, they're protecting their residents. There is this issue of compliance. So who goes out? The council, the police have to answer these noise complaints. So in the future, the state authorities are also saving money, making it a more harmonious place to live. And if we've got another 30,000 new dwellings in the inner city of Melbourne alone in the next 10 years, now is the time to change this regulation in the Act.
Okay, Bianca, I think Neil Wedd's got a question.
Yeah. We've got a dB meter here at all, because 45 dB is basically silence. Also, the other part of the problem, look at music, what it used to be in St Kilda and what it is now. Times change and places change. St Kilda's not the same as it was. It's very expensive. A lot of the places have closed. East Brunswick, because they sold the building. The Tote went because Bruce had problems, exacerbated by some other things. Phoenix had issues with the landlord. It's not all to do with that, but then you've got Pure Pop has the same problem because they've got a vexatious litigant, and you wish that they could be struck out. And sometimes we've all been, if you've run a venue, we've always had people complaining about noise, imagined or real, as well. So,
but the agent of change principle, just to clarify, it does protect conversely as well. If I open a live music venue next door to you, Kate, then I'm responsible for the change in the environment, so I should be responsible for the soundproofing to protect you.
Yeah.
I'm yet to meet a person who doesn't respect it as a logical principle.
Yeah, of course. And Neil, you're right. I mean, of course things change, but there are some things that we can't affect. If somebody wants to sell the building, if there's no market for, if there's a higher and better use for, that particular building, so be it. I mean, there might be some kind of sentimental case for making an argument, but I mean, things go. But if there's a market for it, if the venue is completely viable, and if the owner doesn't want to give it up as a live music venue, and if none of the patrons want to give it up as a live music venue, and it's being forced to close because, through no fault of its own, it has become non-compliant because of the actions of somebody else, then that's something that needs to be defended, yeah?
Can I just make a point here too? It's not only licensed venues that we're talking about. We run recording and rehearsal studios, for example. There's a tap dancing venue in St Kilda that have been tapping for the glamour pusses there for 10 years. And they're at threat of closure because of neighbourhood complaints. So it touches all aspects. When you're a noise emitter and you've got any type of amplified music or very loud heels, you're up for complaint. And this is why one of the things, our platforms, when we go to the state government, we're really talking about positive culture. And that defines us from other hospitality venues as well. And somehow I think we'll get that through.
Can I just add? I mean, the idea, the reason why we're talking about cultural clusters is, as Helen said, it's becoming increasingly difficult to open up new places, and it's going to become a lot more difficult with the changes to the Building Code of Australia, which I won't get into now. But there are some standards there that are going to make it extremely difficult for small venues to open, and I'm quite worried about it. So it's more and more important that the existing cultural clusters, such as they are, not be preserved. I mean, that isn't the word I would use. I would just say, let's just maintain the conditions for those places to keep on rolling on the way they are for as long as they want to, if that's what's happening. Let's not make it so that they are just forced to close and we haven't got a ready stock of replacement venues.
There's some interesting international examples, one of which comes out of Berlin in Germany, where they were famous for their dance club culture, in that particular instance, not live music. But what happened was developments came in and they closed down those venues as a result. Similar scenario to what we're discussing here. Now, retrospectively, the German government is throwing money to try to create a solution to bring back that culture that they lost. And guess what? They've got the money, but they can't bring it back, because you can't suddenly transplant it to another thing. It was in an area and it was lost forever. And if you think about down there at the Docklands, there is a genuine feeling that part of the workplace discontent down there is that places without culture breed depression. And that culture actually is very healthy for a working and a business environment as well, keeping people happy. Now, is there another question there?
I've been a musician for 30 years, and before that I had a real job, and I was working a night shift job. So basically the hours of my day, I rise at 11 o'clock, go to bed at about 3, and I've had a problem in my little street in South Melbourne for pretty much 7 years with ongoing construction. I rang the council and I was told that I had no right of complaint, that the tradesmen had the right to ply their trade. What I want to know is why music isn't subject to the same sort of controls and rules and regulations as truck drivers, as council leaf blowers, as construction workers in building sites in the suburbs.
In the city of Melbourne, we have construction going on everywhere during the day. Each project we have a construction management plan that allows them to only work normally between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. So they actually can't do any work outside of that. Sometimes they get special permission on the weekends to come in with crane work, because that stops, when crane work happens during the weekday, it actually stops all traffic. So they get special permission to do crane work on the weekend, but normally they're treated under a different requirement, under construction management. I don't have all the details of that, because actually that's not really planning, it's under engineering within the city of Melbourne. Similarly, I would think that other councils would have similar arrangements, that the planning looks at developments and how it complies with the scheme, how it complies with the requirements, whether it's heritage, whether it's waste, whether it's height, setbacks, and all those requirements. In the permit, there will be an area under construction management, which they then have to prepare a plan that goes separately to the engineering for approval. So if people like yourself who work nighttime and sleep during the day, definitely you will be affected. But generally, most people are out during the day working. So that's how the construction management schemes and the plans are put in place for the majority. That's all I can explain on your part. On the second question of why music is different from that, again, it could be a timing issue. Daytime, nighttime, nighttime, daytime. People generally are back at their homes at night. So that's where it becomes an issue.
Is there a case, do you think, also for focusing on and within each council and trying to get some kind of degree of coordination between the different sort of silos of building, engineering, compliance of other sorts, planning? I mean, as chair of the planning committee, you're actually in a very powerful position to ensure that there's some degree of horizontal communication as well as up and down. Is that something that you would look at?
The setup of the council's departments is actually done through administration. We might have influence on how we think things don't quite work because of silos. Personally, I'm actually anti-silo. I've come from a business background. I've worked in large corporations. Silos are actually a hindrance to good delivery of services. That's my personal. My belief is that there needs to be something between the matrix type organizations under some of you might understand the role of a chief operating officer who sees end-to-end responsibility instead of silos, because that's what most organizations are. Councillors don't actually have a lot of influence to change structure within the administrations. As I was told when I got elected back in December 2008, you councillors come and go. We are here forever.
Now, it's interesting because our Lord Mayor Robert Doyle talks about wanting Melbourne to be a 24-hour city, and it's interesting that the rules seem to apply. Most people want it to be a 6 a.m. till 7 p.m. city, and the reality is the creative cultures tend to be a late-night culture. We don't all live in Brighton and walk big dogs. The creative people are up late, and it was it was in, what was it, 1961 when Frank Sinatra sang about New York. I want to wake up in a town that never sleeps. And if you've been to New York, and I know people like to compare Melbourne to big cities, but in simple terms, world-class cities are noisy cities. Cities are noisy, and I think the point made earlier about the measurements for sound relating to 1978, they desperately need review. Can I get another question from the crowd?
Well, in places like St Kilda and other inner city areas, people specifically move into these areas because of access to late night entertainment. People have purchased and rented in these areas specifically for access to late night culture. So I don't understand why we don't have infrastructure that allows for alternative culture that is actually based around late night.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my feeling is that wave of new residents coming into the city are wealthy empty nesters, people who really aren't looking to participate in the late night culture.
It's not quite true. If I go back, say, 10 to 12 years, when you're looking at what I call the high-end apartments, the really rich retirees, and the type of developments they like, and the quality of those. In the city of Melbourne, we look at developments in terms of dollars per square metre. If you're paying for something that roughly $8,000 to $8,500 a square metre, it is the middle of the road. Anyone buys, overseas investors, younger people buying into it. They're generally not the high end. The ones that you're looking at the high end, you are paying between $11,500 to $13,000 a square metre for those apartments. In the last 10 years, 15 years, the ones that fit that category, Freshwater Place, the Republic Tower on the corner of Queen and Latrobe, the Eureka, what else? We've got the Royal Domain and the Melburnian.
And the entirety of Docklands.
Well, that's what they try to project. And in the Docklands, I would say the more high-end are the ones along Yarra's Edge. The ones at New Quay and Waterfront City are not. That's my opinion. Rest of them in the city of Melbourne, they are basically for a lot of the people who just want to live in. They either rent, and the rental is middle of the road, not high-end.
Can I just add something there? Can people change, though? Over a period of time, you may buy into a development and you may then rent out to a new set of residents, and it's not long until you have some sort of turnover there. So, again, we have to look at managing these residents' expectations.
No question on that one.
Yeah.
The managing of the expectations, in some situations, we have what they call the 173 agreements, which actually a new development has an agreement as part of the planning application and the permit to make sure that every single buyer is aware of the conditions and where they are. It's part of buyer beware in some ways, and part of making sure that once you come into this particular development, within the vicinity, these are the current amenities and other types of premises. You cannot then blame the neighborhood. That doesn't stop them complaining, though.
The City of Melbourne actually did have a very interesting table a few years ago in which it had quite differential standards of amenity expectation across the municipality. And that still applies to a point now in that, well, there's only one area, and that is around the Docklands Stadium, which actually eliminates rights to object to noise. So, I mean, there actually is precedent there in the scheme. So, I mean, that would be something else that the council might consider reinvestigating, this idea of actually...
The Docklands is an unusual area. City of Melbourne, in the first 10 years of the development of Docklands, had zero say in it. It was all handled by the state government authority, Big Urban. We had no input into building designs, orientation, open space, public space, amenities, all of that. It's only in the last 3 or 4 years, when bits of it started coming into the City of Melbourne, that we had to spend quite a bit on improving the Docklands. We will be building a library. We've got a community hub there that's a temporary structure for a long time. I'm always advocating for more amenities, but the Docklands itself was probably designed wrong from the beginning.
And here's another classic example. If we don't have those organic cultural clusters that didn't exist in Docklands, for example, we're looking at places like New South Wales who are artificially trying to create these new music venues. And if it comes from government often and not from the artists themselves, it's sanitised. And you'll find that your regular live music goers, it's not necessarily the new type of places they want to visit, something that's been curated by government.
I agree there, because you go to Docklands, there's not really live music. There's a lot of bars, big drinking places. But live music venues in the cities, my sort of music tastes have changed from the Deep Purple and the Black Sabbath and Free and all of those. I'm more into jazz and maybe more classical nowadays, which is still live music. You know? I enjoy seeing musicians perform and produce great music, just as a different genre of music. My daughter, who is in university, goes out twice a week to live music venues. I think Kathy runs into her occasionally. Yes. So I understand that it is part of our culture. It goes back years ago. I used to queue up for concerts on Burke Street outside Metro, or now called the Palace. But as I get older, your taste change, you know. Imagine me going into a venue for young people and they're looking at me, what is this old man doing in here?
No. Well, that's not. Well, I think if you corrected me before. I think music lovers can be of all ages. Now, Helen, you mentioned an interstate example there when you mentioned Sydney, and it appears to me that they are trying to copy the City of Melbourne in developing, trying to artificially generate a laneway culture, while here in Melbourne we're potentially stepping on ours. I know of an example in Brisbane recently where they've adopted this concept of a creative cluster, which is an expression I've heard Kate use. Can you perhaps explain the concept of a cultural cluster, and how that's worked in Fortitude Valley?
Well, I think we could learn a lot from the work that they have done there, because particularly when it comes to the SEP2 or the noise attenuation, they've done great work, and they actually changed the way that they do their noise readings. But what they did there, they created a precinct, and it got a lot of the live music venues that were being encouraged in the first place. It's sort of been overtaken by the party venue as such. So we're finding there's social issues that are arising from that. And the big lesson we've learned here is that what will define us in our future planning in Melbourne is that if we concentrate on positive culture rather than entertainment precincts or zones as such, that's the defining line between us and other hospitality type businesses. But definitely the work they've done, there was a fear that the housing and the retail rents would drop in the area after the precinct was put in. In fact, apparently it's gone up. And it is a buyer beware. When a resident moves into the valley, they know that they don't have a right to complain because they've moved into an existing live music precinct, and the EPA levels are completely different. They're measured from inside. The base levels are done at 2 a.m. from a particular frequency in a nightclub. So we can take from that work when we're implementing our own possible and hopeful review of SEP2, SEP1 with the EPA, which is long overdue, and it's a platform that SLAM are standing for, and we will be bringing it up at the next state government roundtable discussions.
Was there another question from the audience? Yes.
You mentioned cities like New York that are shining examples of cities that never sleep. I wonder what their policy and planning regulations and noise legislations are, and whether they're being successful, and whether you have any insight into what they are and why they're successful. My second question also is, I know we're spending a lot of time on the issues of noise and its effect on the live music scene in Melbourne. What are the other issues that the live music industry are facing at the moment?
Well, look, there are other issues. Noise is at the forefront of our agenda at the moment, because it's something, we tackled that liquor licensing issue, and I think we were successful with that. There are some other issues with liquor licensing. When the object of the Act was changed, so I know a lot of people don't know this 3AA amendment was put in that said the amenity of the outside of your venue can be affected by swearing or graffiti inside. Now, that's something that was put in by the police to challenge Bar 20, and there was no industry stakeholder consultation on that, and it's to be tested now. So there's still licensing work to be done, but other works that need to be done, funding, it's a big one. It's a big one for live music, the inequity of funding, because as we've seen, our small little venues, it's very hard to turn a buck in a live music venue. Most people go in it for the passion and the love, and generally they're hit with compliance, costs. They sell less drinks because people have that creative focus when they're watching a band. So it's important to be supported with less red tape and through funding. And the other thing about Melbourne being this fantastic music city, we're seeing an oversupply of musicians moving here as well. It's lifted the standard, but we run Bakehouse and we deal with bands coming from overseas, interstate all the time, and people are having trouble getting gigs. So the standard of pay for your average practitioner has been incredibly diminished. There's lots of people out there prepared to play for free. And to make a living as a musician is very difficult, particularly in this world of the modern world of digital downloads and pirated, etc.
Live music's become the strongest and most important income stream for your average musician, because physical CD sales has dropped off. Can I see a hand up? in the very back. Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Yeah, just on that mention of rent increases, the Phoenix Lounge was mentioned earlier before. One thing that hasn't come up was the Art House, which closed 2 years ago. Both subject to new landlords or existing landlords who have essentially strong-armed the managers of the clubs into trying to pay more. What sort of protections can be in place to prevent landlords squeezing the owners of live music venues?
I think there's very little that, I mean, apart from, I mean, they have to actually operate within the terms of the law. But, I mean, again, it's a little bit like the owner deciding to sell, do you know? I mean, there's not a lot that can be done about that. So what I'd be looking at is trying to get a mortgage or low-income loan system going so that the venue operators can actually buy venues themselves.
Having run music venues for really like 30 years, the musicians are in fact, for all the part that it's the poor musician, it's the poor musician that employs the agent and the manager who supposedly strong-arm the venue into doing. In fact, it's actually the musician at the end part is the person, reasonably successful musicians, that make it really hard to run a venue. You know, I used to get $2 a head, and Joe Galtieri, who's run the venue, we used to get $2 a head in the 80s. We are still getting $2 a head in 2010. And in fact, that is a major problem as to why it's very difficult to make live music work.
Everyone in this room probably refers to Melbourne as the live music capital of Australia, and it's good that we've got forums like this to discuss issues and address potential stumbling blocks. But I also think it's worth considering that the City of Melbourne doesn't do enough to defend or promote its reputation as the live music capital. People here who've been to Austin, Texas for South by Southwest will know when you step off the aeroplane there are musicians playing at the baggage carousel, and everywhere you turn there's music and musicians, and Melbourne's a long way away from that. We do nothing, and maybe if we had live music capital of Australia on our number plate, it would make politicians in the City of Melbourne think more about those things.
Solved.
But if I could firstly thank you, the audience, for coming along to this Toff Talk series, and to the City of Melbourne for its conversation series. I particularly want to thank our panellists, Councillor Ken Ong, who's come down, Kate Shaw from the University of Melbourne, and Helen Marcoux. And we hope to see you again at future Toff Talks. Thanks once again.